Hello, my name is Karen, and I am an occupational therapy student at Kaiser University's MS-OT Bridge program. As part of my virtual fieldwork experience, I am creating weekly YouTube videos regarding various topics. This week's video is a debriefing session with multiple questions about this week's learning. The first question is, what did you learn while completing this week's simulation? This week, we had the opportunity to watch a physical therapy evaluation for a patient who was recently admitted to the hospital after a stroke. This was an interesting experience as I've had the opportunity to observe informally different physical therapy and speech therapy sessions, but I've never had the chance to actually get to see an evaluation from a discipline different than occupational therapy. It was interesting to see how the physical therapist interacted with the patient and performed different assessments to get his information. But what was most interesting was seeing how I could use the information he gathered and translate it to creating goals for myself. So just because I wasn't able to see the patient participate in functional activities such as dressing or bathing, I could still see her performance with the physical therapist and make clinical judgment decisions to decide how she might perform with basic activities of daily living, and therefore create short and long-term goals for my sessions as an OT. The next question is, why is it important to understand the different community resources that are available to clients? I believe this is crucial as it is a large portion of our plan of care with our client. In order to successfully be training them, we're not only responsible for their performance while they're with us during therapy, but we're also responsible for helping transition them to their next setting, especially if this is transitioning them home, where they're going to be receiving much less assistance than they are while they're in the facility with us, whatever setting that might be. Part of this is making sure we provide them with the correct community resources to help facilitate that process and promote independent functioning in their home, as well as promoting safety. Some community resources we might provide the patient with include some information on pharmacies that deliver medication, some information on different services that can perform IADLs for them, such as grocery shopping, cleaning, laundry, meal preparation, and also providing resources on where they can get the equipment they might need, whether it be purchasing it or renting it through a company that's local to them. The next question is, if you had to choose, which assessment component was your favorite that you observed during the physical therapy evaluation? I really enjoyed getting to observe the balance assessment. This is not something that I get to do frequently as a CODA currently, and I think it's an interesting challenge to be the first therapist getting the patient up. So even though I might be able to do transfers and walking with my patients, that's after their first evaluation. I have the therapist notes to go off of. I have a rough idea of how the patient's going to be performing. But getting to see the physical therapist get the patient up for the very first time and not having any idea how she was going to do was really neat to see, and I think that would be really challenging as a therapist, but a fun kind of challenge that would test your skill level. The next question is, if you had to choose, which assessment component did you observe that you found to be the most challenging and why? Observing the sensory testing, I think, was the most challenging for me, just because personally I'm not as strong with sensory, knowing like which nerves correlate to which portion of the body that the therapist is providing tactile input to. So sometimes if I have my notes in front of me, that's a little bit easier to judge, but just going in blind and being able to say, oh, the patient's not able to feel sensation here, I still struggle with knowing the dermatome and which nerves that's responding to. So that assessment was definitely a little bit more challenging for me and something that I learned I need to brush up more on. The final question is, as you noticed, physical and occupational therapy share certain assessment components. What would you do in situations where you, the occupational therapist, obtained different results as the physical therapist during your assessment? I think this does a lot to do with which aspect is getting different scores between the two different therapists. Is it something that falls under one domain versus the other? So for example, if during the physical therapy evaluation the patient had to go to the restroom and the physical therapist said, oh, I had to do all the steps for them, they were total assist for toileting, and their toilet transfer was a max assist. But then the occupational therapist goes in later in the day and does the same task, but gets a mod or a max for toileting and a mod assist for the transfer. I would err with the occupational therapist in this situation because that's something that falls under the occupational therapist's domain. They know how to correctly cue that patient and maybe set them up for a little bit higher performance. versus where if it was like bed mobility or bed transfer, that falls under physical therapy. So typically you're going to rule with the physical therapist score in this situation. One other thing to consider though is depending on your facility, how are you being instructed with scoring your evaluation? At my facility, on the initial evaluation, we're not supposed to provide any interventions. So in that case, we wouldn't be providing any cueing on how to complete the toilet transfer or providing any tips on body mechanics or proper sequencing during toileting. So without providing that intervention, the occupational therapist score might be a little bit lower. But then, even if they're different, also depending on your facility, you might be instructed on that initial evaluation to go with the lower score. Or if you're on the edge between, I don't know if it was a mod or a max, typically on that first session, they want you to go a little bit lower so that you're fully capturing the burden of care. Taking all of this into consideration, though, I still stand by of which aspect was it and whose domain did it fall under, and as far as determining whose score you're going to accept as the score for the assessment. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I look forward to joining you next week for our final video.